All right. Good afternoon again. Thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. As I was introduced, my name is Pooja Nakamura. I'm from the American Institutes for Research, based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And I'm very excited today to share with you this presentation that's entitled Words Fail Learners Again and Again. And it's about unpacking the research base on language of instruction, transition policies, mother tongue policies, and foundational literacy. So it's a focus on foundational literacy and learning to read across low and middle income countries with a focus on South and Southeast Asia. So quickly, just to unpack the agenda and to kind of give you a roadmap of what I will be talking about today, I'm going to motivate some of this research. I'm going to talk first, kind of chunk it into how words fail learners in supporting their literacy development when they begin school. So this would include us understanding together what we mean by foundational literacy. We have to just kind of define for 1 second what it means to learn to read. In different conferences, we go from learning to read as part of language, but here we are in a language conference where language is at the heart of learning. It's been said over and over again, and I don't need to make that pitch. So language is at the heart of learning. It is the core of what we do and how that fits into our definition of foundational literacy. How literacy acquisition is different in different languages, because that's going to have deep implications for how we design our curricula, design our standards and assessment, and how long a child takes to learn to read a language. And how do we know what that first language of instruction should be? We know it has to be a language a child understands. We know that. We all believe it. At least I hope we do. But how do we know what that is in different kinds of multilingual environments? And is it one or many? And then how we're failing learners again when we transition them from one language to another. So in this chunk of the presentation, I'm going to talk about what empirical evidence, what rigorous research do we have to determine what the right timing is to introduce a new language and to make successful bilingual readers or multilingual readers. And then I'll end with applying this evidence base into what we're calling the foundational learning improvement package, both literacy and numeracy, in teacher training and taking it to scale in different parts of the world. And some final thoughts. So, as we all know, we're deep in the middle of a learning poverty crisis. And with pre-pandemic, about half the children in low and middle income countries in public schools couldn't read a single word after 2 to 3 years of schooling. We're now getting close to 70% of children in low and middle income countries. 70%, that's 2/3 of every classroom, cannot read at grade level. So it is a crisis situation. Now, multilingualism is widespread in these contexts. And this manifests itself in multiple different ways, right? Multilingual children, multilingual communities, multilingual policies, implemented or not. But multilingualism, or functional multilingualism, is widespread. And on average, we know that almost 40% of children in low and middle income countries, with this paper that the World Bank put out loud and clear, are not being taught in languages they use and understand. So we have this baseline that's pretty dismal. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there is clear evidence that there is a significant link between the post-colonial language, or the later acquired language, and socioeconomic mobility. The demand for these languages are not going away, they increase, and there's a need to understand how to have empirical reconciliation to these questions of how do we teach reading differently in different languages? Do we know what that first language of instruction should be? And very critically, how do we know when a child is ready to learn a new language in order for them to become biliterate or multilingually literate? So not one language pitted against another, but how to become biliterate or multilingually literate. So if we're talking about literacy as our interest, our outcome of interest, let's just define it for a second. So foundational literacy is essentially essentially, I mean, we can talk about this for hours and hours and days and years, is understanding the printed word, right? It's understanding a set of printed words. It's understanding what's on paper. So now the number of cognitive steps that takes to get from here's your passage on a piece of paper or your passages into comprehending what that is multiple steps in multiple cognitive and linguistic subconstructs, right? So it's complex, it's multifaceted, and it's an integrated process that changes over time. So what reading comprehension looks like to a 5-year-old does not look like reading comprehension to a 10-year-old. However, universally, reading comprehension requires both the ability to decode and its respective subskills, decode, sound out what's on paper, and to understand the oral language, right? So these two come together in order for a child to be able to decode. So we've kind of taken multiple theories of reading comprehension across multiple different language types, multiple different models, and created this house. And I just kind of want to keep this house at the back of our mind as we talk about things through the rest of the presentation. So if we want to build a house of reading comprehension, which is the roof, we have to dig the foundation. And for that foundation, teachers, policymakers need to be able to make sure the child has all the prerequisite skills. You need to have the working memory, the attentional control, the socio-emotional skills, all of that at the foundation. And then you have to have these two pillars, and these two pillars is what I want to make sure we all agree is needed. You can't have one pillar and the roof will not stand without the other pillar. So one pillar is the decoding pillar, or the sound symbol correspondence, the ability to sound out the words. Now, if you are a Spanish reader or a Kiswahili reader or a language speaker, you can probably decode a Kiswahili passage if you're an English reader here in this room, right? If you can decode the alphabet, you can probably decode Spanish or Kiswahili. What I'm trying to say is you have one pillar. You're probably not going to get the roof to stand because all the comprehension questions I'm going to ask you in Kiswahili, you probably won't understand them unless you're a Kiswahili speaker, even though you have the decoding as fluently and quickly as you can. So you need the other pillar, which is the language comprehension. You need to be able to understand the oral language that's presented to you. So you can have, say, a non-literate adult who has just the language comprehension pillar, but zero decoding, right? So they're not going to be able to get to reading comprehension either. So you need both these pillars for the roof to stand. And up on the beam, I've kind of put oral reading fluency, which is more like a beam that holds up. So oral reading fluency is basically the speed and accuracy with which you have these skills. So you need to be able to understand the language, one pillar, obviously. And the other one is that you have to be able to decode. That means sound out the symbols, which means you need to understand the symbol sound correspondence rules of that language, the match. So those are the two things, and then those sub-skills are underneath that every child has to get in one language to be able to read with comprehension. Now here we're talking about multiple languages, but let's just talk about how these are different across different languages for a second. So one big thing that's different across different languages is phonology, right? The sound that are represented in the language. So phonology is the way the sounds of that language are organized. The ability to hear the sounds of a particular language is universally predictive of how well a child will learn to read in a particular language. But the type of phonology that's used in different languages is different. Right? So teachers and curricula do need to focus on the type of phonology that's used in that language. So for example, in English, we have onset rhyme, k, at, and p, ul, but that breakdown, it doesn't make sense in other languages, obviously. And you have to get down to the phonemic level, which is the smallest sound segment in English. So you have to be able to say k, at, to be able to decode in English, So that's in English. But if you go to most South Asian and Southeast Asian languages that are called alpha syllabic, you get phonemes plus schwa, and you get consonant clusters. So you say pa, but you don't say p the same way you say p. You have an inherent vowel. So it's a different sound structure, and you have dual syllable phoneme awareness. So what's the first sound that you're hearing in a particular word in English is not what's the first sound you're hearing in a particular different language. So Here you need syllable and phoneme. In Kannada and in Hindi, for example, it's always a syllabic block, but there are phonemic constructs within that syllabic block. But that's just to show that there are different types of phonology that are important in different types of languages. Now, moving from the phonology, the sounds, there are only 4 different major types of writing systems in the world, right? And this is the mapping mechanism of the sounds to the symbols. So if you have an alphabetic language, the one on top, that's when phonemes, the smallest unit of sound, are mapped, right? So for cat, k, at. Then you can have purely syllabic languages like Japanese, kana, for example, so that's tako. So ta, in the ta, so this is the black on the right, there's no, the ta, the first symbol over there, there's nothing to break it up with ta and a. There's no orthographic representation of ta and a separately. It's ta, right? And so that's a purely syllabic. So you can't break ta into anything else or ko into anything else. It's ko, and it's just ko as is. And then if you move on to the purple, the third row, that's mostly in South and Southeast Asia. So those are called Akshara and Fidel in Ethiopia, or the Gaze script. And these scripts have syllabic blocks, always syllabic blocks, with phonemic markers within the syllabic block. So if you see the purple third row, that's ka in Kannada, and then ki, which is just that little thing on top, and then kri, which is now you're adding the r at the bottom and the little thing on top. So basically, the reader, the child, needs to know that there are phonemic components within the syllabic block, and to be able to recognize those in order to be able to read. And then you go to morphosyllabic East Asia, sometimes called logographic, but these are the ones that have morphemes embedded and they're always syllabic. So, umi or hashi in Nihongo, Japanese, they don't have any phonetic symbols in there. Those also have meaning of ocean and bridge, right? So, the nature in which your language or a language maps phonology into orthography has a significant consequence for how teachers are taught to teach reading to their children. And I think it's really important that they learn phonics approaches that are appropriate for the mapping of their languages. So that's one side of orthography. There's also depth. And this has, F came down here. This has huge implications for, say, oral reading fluency or types of assessments that are used. So if there's a one-to-one correspondence between sounds and symbols, it's called a transparent language. So, for example, if you see Spanish is relatively transparent, right? So you see G-A-T-O, you get gato, right? And this is an example in Hindi where the first ka is always ka, la is always la, ma is always ma. So it's kalam, no matter what, where you put that ka sound. But then you take English and the symbol that looks like an E, that symbol has so many different sounds or no sounds depending on where it is in what word. So that's a relatively deep language. So if you think about it for a second, if a child sees the sentence, there are not enough giraffes in the zoo, and they read it out to you loudly, fast, that's oral reading fluency, the chances that they understand that sentence are pretty high. You can't just say there are enough giraffes in the zoo just out of memory. Chances are you really understand those words because you're able to decode them because they're opaque words. But like I said, if I give you a Spanish sentence or a key Swahili sentence, chances are you can decode it and probably not understand it. Again, what are we teaching? The speed of reading, the accuracy of reading, where does oral reading fluency have a role in teaching reading? Now that's depth. Then you have breadth, right? So in Kannada, again, a South Indian language, Kannada, you have large orthographic sets. You have more than 400 graphemic combinations. Now you might be saying, hey, it's a relatively shallow orthography, so you learn the symbols, then you can always decode. But you've got a chunk of symbols to go through. And so the timing of acquisition of these standards for different grades for different children is different across different countries and languages. And I'm only in one language. So then when you go to independent consonants, and phonemic diacritics and multiple phonemes in each syllable, there's a whole chunk that needs to be unpacked for that child. So it takes longer, science has shown, to master basic decoding skills up to grade 4 or 5, as opposed to grade 2 in alphabetic languages. So if we go from there, basically within one language, the amount of time to teach decoding skills is language specific. The degree of importance placed on teaching and assessing oral reading fluency is language specific. Approaches to phonics and literacy instruction is language specific. And now we get to the phonological and orthographic distance between the two languages. Now you have alphasyllabic to alphabetic languages, and you have one that they speak at home, which is not a language that even has a script, right? So now we're looking at the differences between the two languages and how those play out. But before we go there, how do we know which language we're teaching the kids in the first language? We're teaching them in languages they use and understand. We're teaching them in the languages they code switch at home. We're teaching them in the languages of the community. How often do we know what that is, really, empirically? Sometimes we do, and it's very clear. And sometimes we don't. And it's a question of how we're trying to map this empirically. So as we know, the house of foundational literacy will not stand without language comprehension skills. Language is at the heart of learning. But widespread multilingualism exists across LMICs. This could be children being functionally multilingual. So in the kid's head, there's 1, 2, 3.65 languages. It could be a functionally multilingual community. So some kids speak a particular language and another group of kids speak another. There could be linguistic heterogeneous classrooms. So children coming in pre-K 1 and 2 come from different mother tongue groups or different groups. Languages that are spoken by a small number of learners in very remote regions, which we've heard a lot about today as well. And there could be languages without scripts. So in balancing scalable, cost-efficient programming at a policy level for foundational literacy, how do we balance out these different considerations? So I'm going to just show you a quick example of some kind of language mapping that is not self-reported that we have done, just to give you a sense of how that helps us understand which should be the first language of instruction. So we did this in Mozambique. We've now done it in other countries as well, in Benin, in Lesotho. We're doing it in 7 other countries across Africa and Asia. So the question was not to see whether child A speaks X language. The question was to see how well they speak X language and whether or not they will benefit from literacy instruction in X language. So in order to do that, we classified children as monolingual, meaning in all the languages we tested them to speak in, which was given every choice of language they could want to be tested in, they had only one that was dominant. Even if they said 1 or 2 words in the other language, it didn't come close to their one language. So they really were monolingual speakers. They were children, so they can only learn in that language, like L1, red language. If they're not taught in the red language, they're not going to learn to read. There were children we classified as L1 bilinguals. So these are children who we classified as bilingual. They were equally likely to succeed in instruction in either language. So their words and their ability to speak and understand the languages was pretty similar, whether it was a mother tongue or not, in these 2 languages, and they could benefit from instruction in either language. And then we had the emerging bilinguals, those who had another language, but it was way lower. But it was not just a word or 0 words or 0.5 words. It was something that they could really speak and do with that language, but not quite as close to their dominant language. So we have a kind of bridging mechanism for these children if they want to become bilinguals, or if the L1 is the language of school, then we can continue on with that. But they will benefit only in the L1 as it stands. If they are in a medium of instruction of L2, the gray L2, they're likely to not succeed. So in Mozambique, we found that there were major discrepancies between self-reported data. Yeah, I can speak Portuguese and different languages, but they were like 48.4% said they could speak 2 languages, but only about 8.5% were empirically classified as being able to benefit from instruction in those 2 languages. So we then mapped out which was the most likely language of instruction that would succeed as the first language of instruction in each area. And then this was to see how many children were actually learning in languages they understood. And the red dots were where 50% of the children didn't understand the teacher in the classroom. And this one is 80%. So when we really want to make sure that, sorry, the one on top is 50%, and the one at the bottom was if we wanted 80% of the children to understand the language of the teacher, it's only the blue schools that had that. So this was pre-changing of the policy, but this was just to show how language mapping in Mozambique helped us determine that first language of instruction. That's still first language of instruction. So going really quickly now to introduction of a new language. I mean, our goal is bilingual children, multilingual children, right? So how do we know, and could we know, when a child is ready to learn to read in a second language? So reading in a second language, and I have to say that I'm using the words mother tongue first and second, but I know it's L 4.5x in different places. So just bear with me with terminology. So as policymakers and curriculum developers, we don't want to rebuild a wall that can be shared. So we have to start preparing for a curriculum from grade 0 that has that built-in wall that can be shared, and then you just put your money into building the other pillar of oral skills. So how do we develop programs that really draw on these resources? So in one study that we did in India, we looked at Kannada and Telugu as a first language, and we looked at English as a second language. And I wanted to show you this one set of graphs. So we found that, on this x-axis at the bottom, we see the local language reading, right? And then on this y-axis over here, we see English reading. So we see what we've seen for decades in research, okay? The better the L1, the better the L2. Mother tongue-based multilingual education, we know that. The longer the mother tongue, the better the English. But if you do like a correlation or linear regression, what you find is a straight line, right? You say, oh, one correlates with the other. But what we wanted to do was, is there a tipping point? Is there a point at which there's a threshold of readiness for the new language? And so what we did was, we kind of looked at local language development in buckets. So as local language was developing from 0% to 20% on a particular task that I can talk about later, the English didn't improve that much if it was introduced. But when you went from 20 to 40%, the English didn't improve that much even if it was introduced. They didn't have enough local language to support transfer. When we went from 40 to 60, still 0. There was almost no correlation. It was almost non-correlated. When we went from 60 to 80, there was an exponential leap in English uptake. So it was very clear that there was a threshold, and we did a variety of statistical analysis to show that there was no correlation prior to 60% and a significant correlation post 60% that can now be used as a tool in the classrooms for determining readiness of acquisition of a second language based on first language reading skills. So we're testing that now in many countries, including I'll show you in 1 second. So that's one set of studies. I'm going to actually go really quickly through this one, which is just a different study that we're doing, looking at policy, school, and cognitive factors that predict learners' ability to transition to a new language in multiple countries, and one of them is the Philippines. We're just starting this. We don't have the data yet, so I just wanted to just highlight that. And I know I'm very short on time, so I'm going to go into Flip for the next couple minutes, which is now taking all this evidence that I just talked about and applying it into a package called the Foundation Learning Improvement Package. That's at scale. So it's a full comprehensive foundation literacy package, which has classroom assessments that do these things that I'm just talking about: language mapping, language transitioning, building that house model in the L1 and the L2. It's got a deep focus on language and science of learning, and it's implemented through existing educational stakeholders. So we want the governments to own this, with digitization as appropriate and research as appropriate as we go through it. So just to show you what it looks like, it has the classroom-based assessments. So the teacher, say for oral vocabulary, it's a whole package, asks which girl is singing, this one. And then that data is mapped with these empirical thresholds. And the key thing here is, like, you get into groups of animals. Here are all the giraffes, here are all the tigers, here are all the lions. Actually, I shouldn't do carnivore, prey and predator. We don't, it's very well thought out in terms of which animals can be in which groups. And then they get a score and they get a grouping. And then it's directly linked to what the teacher does with that score immediately. It's not an assessment that just sits somewhere. The teacher then takes that information and targets the language and the sub-skill of importance to build that house up. It's got supplementary materials. We've done this in Laos. I'll show you in a second. And continuous teacher training and support. So this flip, we are actually implementing it. We've done pilots in Laos and in Guatemala, and we're doing it in Benin and Lesotho right now at scale with the governments. The government owns it. After 2 years, the government's actually taken it, Benin, and training on their own. So in Laos, we worked in Khammouane province, in Shebangphe and Zai Putong. And we had, this was in 2018. So we had 100 schools. They were Lao-only schools, even though 30% of them were non-Lao speakers. Probably more. This one was not empirically determined. And it was an alpha-syllabic orthography. This was one of our first pilots in which we had trainings that were very well attended and effective. Continuous coaching was very helpful. And we had improved attendance and perceived teacher outcomes increased, and student outcomes also increased. This was our first pilot. Since this pilot, we've had several learnings on fine-tuning how often we can do this. 3 months is too often. Every day is too often. Like for which skill do we need to do it more often and less often? So we fine-tuned all of that in Benin and Lesotho, and we're continuing to work on the evidence we're gathering from these implementations. So I'm just going to end there with a couple of final thoughts. I think there's a really big need for us to kind of have a multilingual learning science to help us solve the learning poverty crisis in multilingual contexts. We have the problem statement that there is a learning crisis and that they're all in multilingual contexts. But we don't have the multilingual learning science. We're relying heavily on monolingual learning science, alphabetic learning science, reading science, to kind of say, this is what we need. These are the sub-skills that Asar has. These are the sub-skills that Edgar has, to kind of really understand the bilingual or multilingual brain in a way that we can implement it in the classroom and implement policies accordingly. So what does it mean to have an effective multilingual education program or policy? We know that it has to be grounded in a child's own language. I'm steering clear from all the terms. It's just a terminology issue. It is the mother tongue. It could be the father tongue, the uncle tongue, but it is the mother tongue. It is the language most familiar to the child as measured by a language mapping that's not self-reported, right? So as quantitatively, empirically, objectively defined as possible. And it has to be designed for multilingualism that's focusing on transfer facilitation as opposed to interference from the beginning, from the get-go. What are the skills that are likely to transfer, and how do we build that in right from the get-go? And a focus not on what grade should we be introducing English, or not on what age should we be introducing Spanish or French, but a skill-based multilingual education policy, a skill-based understanding of those houses and where those bricks are failing, where are the leaks, where is the water coming in, and what do we need to plug even in this 10-year-old child who doesn't have it in the languages you want to teach them in. And then pulling all this together to harness the additive power of multilingualism for improving literacy and setting up for resilient education systems. Thank you.